Jinho Park stepped off the plane at Los Angeles International Airport just after 9 p.m., his body heavy with the kind of tired that only a 14-hour flight from Seoul can bring. The air inside the terminal felt stale, too cold, too loud, too bright, but he didn't mind. He'd been away from home for 8 days, stuck in back-to-back meetings about semiconductor exports, and all he wanted now was to hug his wife, kiss his daughter's forehead, and sleep in his own bed for a full 8 hours without someone knocking on his hotel room door at 6 a.m. He adjusted the strap of his worn leather briefcase and walked slowly toward the immigration line, his carry-on rolling quietly behind him. At 58, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built a life through discipline and hard work. He'd come to the U.S. as a graduate student in the late 80s with $300 in his pocket and a dictionary in his backpack. Now he ran a small but respected consulting firm that helped American tech companies navigate partnerships in Asia. He wasn't rich, but he was proud of his family, his citizenship, and the quiet dignity he carried with him wherever he went. He looked like any other weary traveler except for one thing: his face. With his neatly combed salt and pepper hair, strong jawline, and calm, steady eyes, he bore a striking resemblance to Yoon Suk-yeol, the current president of South Korea. It wasn't something he thought about often. Back home in Seoul, people sometimes did double takes or whispered behind their hands. But in California, where he'd lived for over 30 years, it rarely came up. Most Americans couldn't tell one East Asian face from another, let alone recognize the president of a country halfway across the world. So he never gave it a second thought. But tonight was different. The airport buzzed with unusual energy. Uniformed officers stood in clusters near the gates. More TSA agents than usual patrolled the corridors. A few men in dark suits with earpieces moved with purpose through the crowd, scanning faces like hawks. Jinho noticed it right away. He'd heard on the flight that a high-level diplomatic delegation was arriving in LA the next day for a G20-related summit, and security had been ramped up accordingly. He didn't pay it much mind. Diplomats came and went all the time. He just wanted to get through customs, grab his bag, and get home. He cleared immigration without issue. His U.S. passport, well worn at the edges, earned him a quick nod from the officer. At baggage claim, his suitcase appeared right on time. He zipped it shut, hoisted his briefcase back onto his shoulder, and headed toward the exit, following signs for ground transportation. That's when he saw him. A man in a plain navy jacket, no uniform, but the way he stood, arms crossed, eyes sharp, gave off the unmistakable vibe of law enforcement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and a tense set to his jaw. He wasn't looking at the crowd in general. He was watching specific people, and as Jinho passed within 10 feet of him, the man's gaze locked onto him like a laser. Jinho felt it instantly, the weight of being watched. He kept walking, head straight, posture relaxed. He'd learned long ago not to react when someone stared. Sometimes it was curiosity. Sometimes it was suspicion. Either way, the best response was calm indifference. But the man stepped forward. "Hey, you, stop right there." The voice was firm, edged with authority. Jinho turned slowly, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "Yes?" he said, voice even. "ID now." Jinho blinked. "I just cleared customs. I have my passport. Doesn't matter. Show me your ID." There was no badge, no introduction, just a demand. Jinho hesitated for half a second, not out of defiance, but confusion. He'd never been stopped like this before in an American airport. But he didn't argue. He reached for his jacket pocket where he kept his driver's license in a small leather wallet. That's when everything went wrong. As his hand moved toward his chest, the officer's whole body tensed. His eyes flickered not at Jinho's face but at his hand, then back to his face, then to the briefcase. Something clicked in the officer's mind. Maybe it was the suit. Maybe it was the way Jinho carried himself, composed, quiet, almost regal. Or maybe it was the vague, nagging memory of a news clip he'd seen days earlier. The South Korean president arriving in New York, surrounded by agents, looking stern and focused. The officer didn't recognize the president, but he recognized something. And in his stressed, overworked brain, trained to spot anomalies in high alert zones, that something became a threat. "Don't move," the officer barked, stepping closer. "Hands where I can see them!" Jinho froze, his wallet halfway out of his pocket. "I'm just getting my license," he said, voice still calm but now edged with concern. "I'm a U.S. citizen. I live here." But the officer wasn't listening. His training had kicked in, or maybe his fear had. He saw a man who looked foreign, dressed formally, acting suspiciously near a sensitive area during a high-security event. And in that split second, his mind filled in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. Before Jin-ho could say another word, the officer grabbed his arm and shoved him hard against the nearest wall, a smooth, cold surface near a bank of payphones that no one used anymore. The impact knocked the air from Jin-ho's lungs. His briefcase clattered to the floor. His glasses slipped off and hit the tile with a sharp crack. "Get down!" the officer yelled, though Jin-ho hadn't resisted. He swung his arm back and struck Jin-ho once, hard on the shoulder, more to assert control than to injure. But it hurt like hell. Jin-ho gasped, his knees buckling slightly from the shock. People nearby stopped walking. A woman covered her mouth. A teenager pulled out his phone. "Why are you doing this?" Jin-ho managed to say, his voice strained but still clear. "I haven't done anything." The officer ignored him, yanking his arms behind his back. "You're under detention for non-compliance and suspicious behavior." Jin-ho didn't fight. He knew better. He'd seen enough news stories, heard enough warnings from friends. You don't resist. You stay calm. You survive. But inside something broke. Not just from the pain, though his shoulder throbbed and his head spun from the blow, but from the sheer humiliating injustice of it. He'd paid taxes for 30 years. He'd coached his daughter's soccer team. He'd voted in every election since 1992. He'd even served on a jury once, proud to do his civic duty. And now, in his own country, he was being treated like a criminal because he looked like someone else. Someone powerful. Someone important, yet still somehow not American enough to be trusted. A few feet away, a Korean-American college student named Min-ji had been waiting for her ride when the whole thing unfolded. She'd recognized Jin-ho instantly, not as the president, but as someone who looked like him. And she'd seen the officer's face twist with suspicion the moment he made the connection. Without thinking, she lifted her phone and hit record. The video was shaky. Just 15 seconds long, but it captured everything. The shove, the strike, Jin-ho's quiet plea, the officer's harsh commands. She posted it to a Korean-American community group on social media with a simple caption. "This happened at LAX tonight. Man looks like President Yoon. Cop attacked him for no reason." She didn't expect it to go far, but within an hour, it had been shared over 1,000 times. Back at the scene, Jin-ho was finally allowed to pick up his broken glasses. His briefcase was returned, slightly scuffed. The officer, now joined by 2 others, escorted him to a small security office near Terminal 4. They asked him questions. Where was he coming from? Who was he meeting? Did he have any connection to the South Korean government? "No," Jin-ho said quietly. "I'm just a businessman. I flew in from Seoul for work. I'm going home to Irvin." They checked his passport again, ran his name through a database. Found nothing. Still, they kept him for nearly 40 minutes, making him sit on a hard plastic chair while they verified his story. All the while, Jin-ho thought about his wife. She'd be waiting by the window watching for his car. Their daughter would have left a note on the fridge. "Welcome home, Appa." Leftover kimchi jjigae in the pot. He just wanted to go home. Finally, a supervisor arrived, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the report, glanced at Jin-ho's bruised shoulder and sighed. "We're letting you go," she said. "There's been a misunderstanding, no apology. Just misunderstanding." Jin-ho stood slowly, wincing as he adjusted his jacket. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. He just walked out into the cool California night, dragging his suitcase behind him, his briefcase in one hand, his broken glasses in the other. He called an Uber instead of waiting for his wife to pick him up. He couldn't face explaining what happened, not yet. Not when his voice might shake. Not when he still felt the sting of being treated like a stranger in the place he'd called home for most of his adult life. As the car pulled away from the terminal, he looked back at the glowing lights of LAX, the same airport where he'd first arrived in America, wide-eyed and hopeful. He wondered if that young man would recognize the country he'd grown to love, or if this moment was just another sign that things were changing. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet night was about to become a national story. And the man who hit him? He had no idea that the person he'd mistaken for a threat was, in fact, just a tired father trying to get home to his family. The Uber ride home felt longer than the flight from Seoul. Jin-ho sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. His shoulder ached with every bump in the road and his head throbbed where it had hit the wall. He kept replaying the moment, the officer's eyes narrowing, the sudden shove, the sharp crack of his glasses breaking on the tile. It wasn't just the pain that stuck with him. It was the look on people's faces, some shocked, some indifferent, one man even smirking like it was entertainment. That's what hurt the most. The feeling of being invisible until he became a spectacle. When he finally pulled into his driveway in Irvine, the house was dark, except for the porch light. His wife must have gone to bed thinking he'd been delayed. He didn't blame her. He texted her a quick "made it home, long day, going to sleep," and slipped inside as quietly as he could. In the bathroom mirror, he saw the red mark blooming on his shoulder and a small cut above his eyebrow he hadn't noticed before. He cleaned it gently, put ice on his shoulder, and lay down fully clothed on the guest room bed, the one they kept for when his mother-in-law visited. He couldn't face their shared bedroom tonight. Not with this shame coiled tight in his chest. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officer's face, hard, certain, convinced he was doing the right thing. And maybe that was the worst part. The man hadn't been cruel on purpose. He'd just been wrong. Dangerously, violently wrong. Meanwhile, across town, the officer, Derek Malone, was finishing his shift. He sat in the break room sipping lukewarm coffee, replaying the incident in his head too. He'd filed his report. Subject matched description of potential impersonator near diplomatic zone. Subject reached for inner jacket pocket in non-compliant manner. Minimal force applied to secure scene. Standard language, clean, by the book. But something nagged at him. The man hadn't fought back, hadn't yelled, hadn't even raised his voice. Just asked calmly, "Why are you doing this?" And those eyes, steady, confused, hurt. Not the eyes of someone hiding something. Still, Malone pushed the thought away. You can't second guess in this job. Hesitation gets people killed. He'd done what he was trained to do. He didn't know that a grainy video of the encounter was already spreading like wildfire online. By morning, Minji's post had been shared by Korean student groups, then picked up by a popular Seoul-based news blog. Within hours, major Korean media outlets were running the clip with headlines like, "Korean-American man assaulted at U.S. airport resembles President Yoon." The South Korean embassy in Washington issued a statement expressing deep concern over the treatment of a U.S. citizen of Korean descent and requested a full investigation. Back in Irvine, Jin-ho woke to his phone buzzing nonstop. Texts from friends, cousins, former colleagues, all asking if he was okay, if it was really him in the video. His daughter, home from college for the weekend, found him in the kitchen making coffee. She'd seen the news. "Appa," she said, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" He didn't answer right away. He just nodded, stirring his coffee too hard. "They're saying you look like the president," she said, showing him her phone. "The video had over 200,000 views already." "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm not him. I'm just me." "But they hurt you because of how you look," she said, tears welling up. "That's not fair." He reached out and squeezed her hand. "Life isn't always fair," he said. "But we keep going." Still, as the day went on, the story grew. A Korean-American civil rights group called him, offering legal help. A local news station asked for an interview. At first, he refused. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to forget it happened. But then his wife sat him down. "You can't stay quiet," she said. "Not this time. If you don't speak up, they'll do it to someone else. Maybe someone who can't fight back." He thought about that. He thought about the young Korean students who'd messaged him, saying they were scared to travel now. He thought about his daughter who'd grown up believing America was her home, only to see her father treated like a threat in an airport. By late afternoon, he agreed to talk to a reporter, just one, from a trusted Korean language outlet in LA. He spoke softly without anger, just sadness. "I've lived here since I was 23, he said. "I built a business. I raised a family. I love this country. But last night I felt like I didn't belong here anymore." Those words spread faster than the video. At the airport police headquarters, things were unraveling. Command staff had been alerted by early morning. Someone recognized the man in the video, not as the president but as Jin-Ho Park, a scheduled attendee at a private Korean-American business forum the next day. Held in coordination with the visiting G20 delegation, he wasn't a threat. He was a guest. The realization hit like a punch. Malone was called into a meeting with his sergeant and a department liaison. They showed him the embassy statement, the news clips, the growing social media outrage. "Do you know who this man is?" the sergeant asked, voice tight. "He's a U.S. citizen," Malone said. "That's all I knew. But you didn't check. You didn't ask. You just assumed." Malone shifted in his seat. "I saw a guy who looked like a foreign leader, dressed sharp, acting nervous near a high-security zone. I followed protocol. Protocol doesn't mean hitting someone who's reaching for his wallet," the liaison said quietly, "especially when he's done nothing wrong." Malone didn't respond. For the first time, doubt crept in. Had he really seen a threat? Or had he just seen a face that didn't look like his own? That evening, airport officials issued a public statement. "We are deeply concerned by the incident involving Mr. Jin-Ho Park and have launched an immediate internal review. Mr. Park has been contacted and offered our sincere apologies." But the apology felt hollow to many, because by now the story wasn't just about one man or one officer. It was about every time someone had been stopped, questioned, or treated with suspicion just because of how they looked. Asian elders harassed on subways. Students followed in stores. Families told to go back to their country, even when they'd never lived anywhere else. Jin-Ho didn't see himself as a symbol. He was just a tired man who wanted to go home. But the world had other plans. The next morning, as he sat at his kitchen table nursing his bruised shoulder, his phone rang again. This time it was someone from the South Korean consulate in Los Angeles. They wanted to meet. They wanted to hear his story in person. And they wanted to make sure he knew he wasn't alone, he agreed. Not for himself, but for the others. The ones who wouldn't get a call from the consulate. The ones who wouldn't have a video go viral. The ones who'd just walk away, head down, and pretend it didn't happen. As he got ready to leave, his daughter handed him a new pair of glasses, same style as the broken ones. "Wear these," she said, "so the world can see you clearly." He smiled faintly and put them on. At the same time, across town, Malone sat alone in his patrol car during a quiet shift. He'd been pulled off active duty pending review. No one said it outright, but he knew he was being watched now, not as an officer, but as a problem. He scrolled through his phone and saw a headline: "Airport cop assaults Korean-American man mistaken for president." The word assaults stung. He hadn't meant to assault anyone. He'd meant to protect. But intent didn't erase impact. And as he stared at Jin-Ho's face in the news photo, calm, dignified, wounded, he wondered how many other faces he'd misread over the years. How many harmless gestures he'd turned into threats just because they came from someone who didn't look like him. He didn't have answers, only questions, and a growing sense that the job he loved might have changed him in ways he didn't like. Back at the consulate, Jin-Ho spoke for over an hour.
He didn't ask for money.
Didn't demand punishment. He just asked for understanding. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else," he said. "Not because I look like a president, but because I'm a person." The officials nodded, took notes, promised action. But as he walked out into the afternoon sun, Jin-Ho knew real change wouldn't come from one meeting or one apology. It would come from people choosing, every day, to see each other, not as threats, not as symbols, but as human beings trying to get home. The days after the airport incident blurred together like rain on a windshield. Everything smudged, moving too fast, impossible to focus on. Jin-Ho tried to return to normal. He answered emails. He scheduled client calls. He even went to the grocery store, though he kept his head down and avoided eye contact with strangers. But normal didn't feel possible anymore. Every time he passed a police car, his stomach tightened. Every time someone glanced at him too long, he wondered if they saw a threat, or just a man who happened to look like someone important. What he didn't expect was how quickly the story would grow beyond him. By the end of the week, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Korean news networks ran segments not just about the assault, but about the everyday experiences of Korean Americans. How often they were asked, "Where are you really from?" Even after decades in the U.S., how their accents were mocked, how their success was treated as suspicious. A popular talk show in Seoul even invited a panel of Korean-American citizens to discuss whether America still felt like home. Back in California, community centers held emergency town halls. Parents worried about sending their kids to school. Elderly neighbors whispered about avoiding the airport altogether. And Jin-ho? He became an unwilling symbol, a quiet man thrust into the spotlight not because he wanted to be seen, but because his face had reminded someone of power, and that reminder had nearly cost him his dignity. Then came the call from the South Korean embassy in Washington. They didn't just want to apologize. They wanted to act. A senior diplomat flew to Los Angeles to meet Jin-ho in person. Over tea in a quiet room at the consulate, the diplomat listened as Jin-ho spoke. Not with anger, but with a deep, aching sadness. "I don't want special treatment," he said. "I just want to be treated like anyone else. Like I belong." The diplomat nodded. "You do belong," he said. "And your story matters. Not because you look like our president, but because you are one of us. And what happened to you could happen to any of us." That meeting led to something unexpected. The embassy coordinated with U.S. State Department officials, who in turn pressured local airport authorities to launch a full internal investigation. Not just into the use of force, but into the broader culture of suspicion that allowed it to happen. For the first time, someone in power was asking not just what happened, but why did it happen and how do we stop it from happening again? Meanwhile, Jin-ho's own body was catching up with him. The bruise on his shoulder faded to yellow, but the headache lingered. He started having trouble sleeping. He'd wake up at 3 a.m., heart racing, replaying the shove against the wall. His wife noticed. She didn't say much, just made him warm soup, turned down the lights earlier, held his hand a little tighter at night. One afternoon, his daughter came home from campus with a folder full of printouts. "People are organizing," she said, spreading the papers on the kitchen table. "Flyers for a rally at LAX. Petitions demanding cultural sensitivity training for airport police. Letters from students, teachers, small business owners, all sharing their own stories of being profiled, followed, or questioned just for existing while Asian. They want you to speak," she said gently. "Not as a victim. As a voice," Jin-ho shook his head. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not brave like that." "You don't have to be loud to be brave, Appa," she said. "You just have to show up." He thought about it for days. He wasn't sure he had the strength. But then he remembered the faces in the airport, how no one had stepped forward to help, how everyone just watched. Maybe that was the real wound, the silence of good people. So he said yes. The rally was held on a Saturday morning outside Terminal 4, the very spot where it happened. Hundreds showed up: Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino families, Vietnamese elders, even allies from other communities holding signs that read, "See us, hear us, protect us." Some wore traditional dress. Others wore t-shirts with Jin-ho's face and the words, "I am not a threat." When it was his turn to speak, Jin-ho stood at the mic, hands trembling slightly. He didn't have notes. He just spoke from the heart. "I came to this country with a dream," he began, voice soft but clear. "I worked hard. I followed the rules. I believed that if I did my part, I would be accepted. But last week I learned that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, your face can still be a crime in someone else's eyes." He paused, looked out at the crowd, mothers holding children, teenagers recording on their phones, older men with tears in their eyes. "I don't want revenge," he continued. "I want change. I want the next person who looks like me to walk through that airport and feel safe. Not scared. Not watched, just free." The crowd erupted in applause. Not the loud, showy kind, but the deep, resonant kind that comes from shared pain and hope. That evening, the local news covered the rally. National outlets picked it up. Even a few international papers ran pieces titled, "The Man Who Looked Like a President and Was Treated Like a Criminal." Back at airport headquarters, the pressure was mounting. Internal Affairs had reviewed the security footage frame by frame. They saw Jin-ho reaching slowly for his wallet. They saw no sudden movements, no aggression, just a man complying until he was struck without warning. The officer, Malone, was officially placed on administrative leave. Not fired yet, but removed from duty while the investigation continued. His union representative argued it was a split-second decision in a high-stress environment. But the department knew the optics were terrible. Worse, the facts didn't support the claim of threat. In private meetings, supervisors admitted what they'd been avoiding. This wasn't just about one bad call. It was about a system that trained officers to see certain faces as inherently suspicious, especially during moments of heightened alert. And that system had failed. Badly, Jin-ho didn't know any of this at first. He was too busy dealing with the aftermath in his own life. Insurance calls, doctor's appointments, explaining to clients why he'd been out of commission. But then a letter arrived. It was from the airport police chief himself. Handwritten, not typed, not signed by a secretary. Real ink on real paper. "I am deeply sorry for what happened to you," it read. "Your experience has exposed a serious gap in our training and judgment. We are committed to doing better, not just for you, but for everyone who passes through our terminals." Jin-ho read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Not because he forgave them yet, but because it was a start. What surprised him most was the flood of messages from strangers. A retired teacher in San Diego wrote, "I taught Korean students for 40 years. This breaks my heart." A veteran in Texas said, "I served this country and so did you. You deserved better." Even a few police officers, off-duty anonymous, sent notes. "We're ashamed. We're working to change things from the inside." It wasn't all support, of course. Online, some comments were cruel. He should have complied faster. Stop playing the race card. If he didn't want trouble, he shouldn't dress like a diplomat. But Jin-ho didn't read those. His daughter made sure of it. She filtered his messages, shielding him from the worst of the noise. Instead, he focused on the good. The high school in Koreatown that invited him to speak to students about citizenship and identity. The local business association that honored him with a quiet award for quiet courage. The neighbor who left a pot of homemade kimchi on his doorstep with a note, "For strength." Slowly, the weight began to lift. Not all at once, but enough to breathe again. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. One afternoon, as he sat in his home office reviewing contracts, his phone rang. It was a blocked number. He almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Park?" a calm, familiar voice asked. "Yes." "This is Yoon Suk-yeol." Jin-ho froze. He thought it was a prank. But the voice, it was unmistakable. The cadence, the tone, the slight formality. It was really him, the president of South Korea. "I saw what happened to you," the president continued. "I want you to know I am deeply moved by your dignity, and I am sorry that my face caused you pain." Jin-ho couldn't speak for a moment. His throat tightened. Finally he managed, "Thank you, Mr. President, but it wasn't your face that hurt me. It was the fear behind the eyes of the man who saw it." There was a pause on the line. Then quietly, "Then let us both work so that no one else has to carry that fear or cause it." They spoke for only a few more minutes. But in that call, Jin-ho didn't feel like a victim or a symbol. He felt seen, fully, completely seen, as Jin-ho Park, a man who loved his family, his country, and his quiet life. When he hung up, he walked outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. His daughter was watering the garden. His wife was setting the table for dinner. He took a deep breath. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The investigation would drag on. The wounds, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But for the first time since that night at the airport, Jin-ho felt something he hadn't expected. Hope, not loud or flashy. Just quiet, steady hope, like the kind that grows in a garden when no one's watching. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding. The weeks that followed felt like living in 2 worlds at once. In one, Jin-ho was just a man trying to heal, rubbing ointment on his shoulder, drinking ginger tea for his headaches, sitting quietly with his family on the porch as the evening cooled. In the other, he was becoming something bigger, a name in headlines, a face on protest signs, a voice in a national conversation about race bias and what it really means to belong in America. He never asked for any of it, but now that it was here, he couldn't look away. The turning point came when a local civil rights organization invited him to speak at a city council meeting about public safety reform. At first he said no. "I'm not a politician," he told his wife. "I don't know how to change laws." "But you know how it feels," she replied. "And that matters more than any law degree." So he agreed. Not to demand punishment, not to point fingers, but to tell the truth, plainly and without anger. The night of the meeting, the council chamber was packed. People stood in the aisles. Cameras lined the back wall. Jin-ho wore the same dark suit he'd worn the night of the incident, the one that had made him look official enough to be mistaken for someone powerful, yet foreign enough to be seen as dangerous. He didn't wear it for symbolism. He wore it because it was clean, pressed, and the only suit that still fit after weeks of stress and poor sleep. When his turn came, he walked to the microphone slowly. He didn't read from notes. He just spoke like he was talking to a neighbor over coffee. "I've lived in this country for over 30 years, he began. "I pay taxes, I vote. I've never been arrested. I've never even gotten a parking ticket. But one night, because I reached for my wallet in an airport, I was treated like a criminal. Not because of what I did, but because of how I looked." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't blame one officer," he continued. "I blame a system that teaches people to see certain faces as threats before they see them as human beings. I've seen it my whole life, in stores, on streets, in schools. It's not always violence. Sometimes it's just a stare, a question, a door that doesn't open, but it adds up. And last month it added up to a shove and a blow in front of my fellow citizens." He looked around the room, not at the council members, but at the people in the audience. The elders with canes, the teenagers holding handmade signs, the mothers clutching their children's hands. "I'm not here to ask for revenge," he said. "I'm here to ask for awareness, for training that teaches officers not just how to react, but how to see, how to pause, how to ask, 'Could I be wrong?' before they act." When he sat down, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then slowly people began to clap. Not loudly at first, but with a deep, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat returning to normal. After the meeting, reporters swarmed him, but he only gave one short statement. "I just want the next person who looks like me to walk through an airport and feel safe, not scared." That night, something shifted, not just in policy, but in tone. Local news coverage began focusing less on mistaken identity and more on racial profiling. Community leaders from other minority groups reached out, sharing their own stories of being misjudged because of their skin, their clothes, their language. A coalition formed, quiet at first, then louder, calling for mandatory bias training for all airport and transit police in the county. Behind the scenes, the pressure on the department grew. Internal Affairs completed its review. The findings were clear. The officer had used unnecessary force. There had been no threat, no justification. The report concluded that implicit bias likely played a role in the officer's perception of danger. The officer, still on leave, was called in for a final interview. This time there was no defensiveness. He sat quietly as his supervisor laid out the facts. "You saw a man who looked like a foreign leader," the supervisor said. "But instead of verifying, you assumed the worst. That's not just a mistake. It's a failure of judgment and of empathy." The officer didn't argue. He just nodded. "I thought I was protecting people," he said quietly. "But I hurt an innocent man. That's on me." He wouldn't be fired. Union rules and past clean records made that unlikely. But he would be reassigned. No more field duty. No more public interaction. Desk work for the foreseeable future. And mandatory retraining, not just on use of force, but on cultural awareness, de-escalation, and recognizing unconscious bias. It wasn't the punishment some demanded. But for Jin-ho, it wasn't about punishment at all. It was about prevention. If this could stop it from happening again, even once, it was worth it. Back home, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Jin-ho's consulting work picked up again. Clients didn't treat him differently. If anything, they respected him more. One longtime partner even said, "You handled this with more grace than most people could. I'm proud to work with you." His daughter started a campus group called Seen and Heard, focused on documenting microaggressions and building allyship across cultures. She came home one weekend with a binder full of student testimonies. Stories of being followed in stores, mocked for their accents, told they speak good English as if it were a surprise. "You inspired this, Appa," she said, hugging him. He shook his head. "No, you did. I just stopped staying quiet." The most surprising change came from within his own community. Older Korean immigrants, many of whom had spent decades keeping their heads down, avoiding trouble, began speaking up. At church gatherings, at grocery stores, at community centers, They shared their own stories of being called spy during the Cold War, of having their businesses vandalized after international tensions flared, of being told to go back even though their children were born here. Jin-ho realized then that his experience hadn't just been personal. It had been a mirror, one that reflected decades of unspoken pain. One afternoon, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden carving, a crane, symbol of peace and longevity in Korean culture, with a note. From a stranger who saw your courage, thank you for giving us permission to speak. He placed it on his desk, next to the president's letter and his daughter's childhood drawing of their family. Meanwhile, the airport announced a new partnership with local Asian American advocacy groups to redesign its officer training program. The curriculum would now include sessions led by community members, not just lectures but real conversations. Officers would hear from elders, students, business owners, people who'd been on the receiving end of suspicion simply for existing. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was movement, and movement, however slow, is better than standing still. Jin-ho was invited to help shape the program. He hesitated at first. I'm not an expert on policing, he told the organizers. But you're an expert on being human, they replied. That's what we need, so he agreed. Not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor, a citizen, a man who believed that understanding could grow, even in the hardest soil. The first training session was held in a small conference room at the airport. Jin-ho sat across from a group of young officers, some nervous, some skeptical, some genuinely curious. He didn't lecture. He just told his story. The flight, the fatigue, the confusion, the fear, the shame. One officer raised his hand. What should I have done differently? He asked. Jin-ho looked at him. Ask first. Assume nothing. And remember, every person you stop has a home they're trying to get back to. The room was quiet. Then one by one the officers nodded. Afterward, an older sergeant pulled Jin-ho aside. My son's in middle school, he said. He's half Korean. I never thought about how the world might see him until I saw your face on the news. Thank you for making me see. Jin-ho didn't know what to say, so he just said, thank you for listening. That night he sat on the porch again, watching fireflies blink in the garden. His wife brought him a cup of barley tea. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything they'd been through, and everything they still believed in. He thought about the officer who hit him. He didn't hate him. He pitied him a little, because the man had been so sure he was right he'd forgotten to be human. And Jin-ho, he'd been so used to shrinking himself to avoid trouble. He'd almost forgotten his own worth. But now he remembered. He wasn't just a man who looked like a president. He was a man who belonged, here, in this country, in this moment, in this life he'd built with his own two hands, and that, more than anything, was worth protecting. 3 months had passed since that night at the airport, and the world felt both quieter and fuller. The headlines had faded. The rallies had ended. The online storm had calmed to a gentle ripple. But in Jin-ho's life, the changes were real, and they were lasting. He still woke early most mornings, made coffee in the same chipped pot, and checked the news before his wife got up. But now when he scrolled past stories about bias or injustice, he didn't just feel helpless. He felt part of something, a slow, steady current of people choosing to do better, to see clearer, to listen deeper. The airport police department had rolled out its new training program. Jin-ho had helped design it, not with rules or lectures, but with stories, his own and those of others in the community. Officers now spent hours in sessions led by Korean American elders, Japanese American veterans, Filipino nurses, and Chinese shop owners. They learned not just about cultural differences, but about the weight of being watched, the sting of being mistaken, the exhaustion of having to prove your belonging over and over again. It wasn't perfect. Some officers still rolled their eyes. Some sessions felt awkward. But others, many others, leaned in, asked questions, stayed late to talk. One young officer even came to Jin-ho after a session and said, "My grandmother was Japanese American. She was put in an internment camp during the war. I never really understood what that meant until now. Thank you for helping me see." Jin-ho didn't take credit. He just nodded and said, "We all have stories. The hard part is making space to hear them." The officer who had struck him, Malone, never reached out directly, but Jin-ho heard through the department liaison that Malone had completed every required retraining module, even the ones not mandated. He'd volunteered to help develop a new de-escalation protocol, and in a closed session with fellow officers, he'd admitted, "I saw a face I didn't recognize and I filled in the blanks with fear. That's on me, and I won't do it again." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was accountability, and for Jin-ho that mattered more than words. As for legal consequences, the city offered a settlement, enough to cover medical bills, lost work, and a modest amount for emotional distress. Jin-ho accepted it not for himself, but because it came with a condition. The funds would go to a non-profit that supported immigrant rights and cross-cultural education. He didn't want money for pain. He wanted to turn pain into purpose. The organization used the donation to launch a belonging initiative, workshops in schools, community centers, even police academies, teaching kids and adults alike how to recognize bias, how to interrupt it, and how to build bridges instead of walls. Jin-ho spoke at the first event. He didn't stand on a stage. He sat in a circle with students just talking. One high schooler asked, "Do you still feel American after what happened?" Jin-ho thought for a moment. "Yes," he said, "because being American isn't about never getting hurt. It's about believing we can heal, together." That line ended up on a mural outside the community center. At home, life had settled into a new rhythm. His shoulder no longer ached. The headaches were gone. He slept through the night again. His daughter graduated from college that spring, and when she walked across the stage, Jin-ho stood in the crowd, clapping so hard his hands stung. Afterward, she hugged him tight and whispered, "You taught me that dignity is the quietest kind of courage." He cried then, not from sadness, but from pride. His wife started teaching Korean cooking classes at the local library. "If people are going to stare," she joked, "let them stare while learning how to make proper kimchi." The classes filled up fast. Neighbors who'd never spoken before now gathered around pots of bubbling stew, laughing over mispronounced words and burnt rice. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, "You know, I used to worry you'd always carry that night with you." "I do," he said softly, but not like a wound, more like a reminder. "A reminder of what?" "That we have to keep showing up. Keep speaking. Keep believing that people can change." She reached for his hand. They sat in silence as the sky turned from orange to deep purple. Meanwhile, the story had taken on a life of its own far beyond California. A documentary filmmaker reached out wanting to tell Jin-ho's story, not as a sensational incident, but as a window into the everyday reality of millions of Asian Americans. Jin-ho agreed, but only if the focus wasn't just on him. "Tell the stories of the people who never made the news," he said. "The ones who walked away in silence. They're the real heart of this." The film, when it eventually aired on public television, was called Scene. It didn't have dramatic music or reenactments, just real voices, real faces, real lives, and at the end, a simple message: you belong here. Back at LAX, things were different too. Security was still tight, diplomats still came and went, but the atmosphere had shifted. Officers made eye contact, said good morning, asked questions instead of making assumptions. A small thing, maybe. But small things, repeated often, become culture. Jin-ho flew again a few months later, for a conference in Chicago. As he walked through the same terminal where it had happened, he felt his chest tighten. But then a TSA agent recognized him, not from the video, but from the training sessions. "Mr. Park," the agent said, nodding respectfully. "Welcome back. Let me know if you need anything." No suspicion, no tension, just courtesy. Jin-ho smiled. "Thank you. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was something quieter, more powerful. Coexistence. The kind built not in grand gestures, but in daily choices to see each other fully." One afternoon, he received a letter from a high school in rural Ohio. A teacher had shown Scene to her class, and the students wrote him letters. One girl, whose grandfather was Korean War veteran, wrote, "I never knew people like you face this kind of fear. I'm sorry, and I'll do better." He read that letter to his wife over dinner. They both cried a little. Now, as summer turned to fall, Jin-ho found himself standing in his backyard again, raking leaves with his daughter home for the weekend. The air was crisp, the trees golden. His granddaughter, just 2 years old, toddled around in a tiny jacket, picking up leaves and giggling. She ran up to him, holding out a bright red leaf. "Appa," she said, using the Korean word for grandfather, though she didn't know its meaning yet. "For you." He took it gently, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Thank you, little one." She beamed and ran off to find another. His daughter watched him, smiling. "You okay?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked. At the woman she'd become, strong, kind, unafraid to speak up. He thought of all the times he'd stayed quiet to keep the peace, to avoid trouble, to fit in. And he thought of how she'd done the opposite, not with anger, but with love. "I'm more than okay," he said. "I'm hopeful," because hope wasn't about pretending the world was perfect. It was about believing it could be better and doing your part to make it so. That night, before bed, he opened his desk drawer and took out the wooden crane, the president's letter, and the settlement agreement. He didn't need to keep them hidden anymore. He placed them on his bookshelf, next to family photos, his citizenship certificate, and a framed picture of his parents, who'd never set foot in America but had dreamed of this life for him. He turned off the light and walked down the hall. In the guest room, now just a guest room again, he paused at the window. Outside, the moon cast a soft glow over the garden his wife had tended all summer. The kimchi crock sat in neat rows. The persimmon tree was heavy with fruit. He took a deep breath. The air smelled like earth, like home. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And that, after everything, was the quietest kind of victory. The story was supposed to end after 5 parts. That's how these things usually go: incident, fallout, reckoning, change, quiet resolution. A clean arc, like a sunset fading into night. But real life doesn't wrap up neatly. It keeps going. And sometimes, long after the cameras leave and the headlines fade, the ripples keep spreading in ways no one expected. For Jin-ho, the biggest surprise came not from officials or news outlets, but from an ordinary Tuesday morning at the local post office. He was mailing a package to his sister in Seoul. Homemade gochujang, dried persimmons, a children's book for his niece, when a man in a faded work jacket stepped up beside him at the counter. The man looked to be in his late 50s with tired eyes and calloused hands. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, shifting his weight, glancing at Jin-ho like he was trying to gather courage. Finally he spoke, voice low. "You're the man from the airport, aren't you?" Jin-ho tensed slightly but nodded. "I am." The man took a deep breath. "My name's Robert. I'm a mechanic over on Main Street. I saw your interview on the news, the one where you said, every person you stop has a home they're trying to get back to." He paused, swallowed hard. That stuck with me. Jin-ho waited. "My son," Robert continued, "he's a cop. Not at the airport downtown, and, well, after what happened to you, I asked him if he ever stopped someone just because they looked out of place. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, maybe. I didn't think about it like that." Robert looked down at his boots. "I raised him to be fair, but I guess I never taught him how to see past his own eyes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn notebook. "I started writing down things I notice now, like how the lady at the pharmacy flinches when my son walks in, even though he's off duty just buying cough syrup. Or how the new family down the block gets asked for ID every time they use the community pool, even though their kids go to the same school as ours." He handed the notebook to Jin-ho. "I don't know why I'm showing you this. Maybe because you made me realize silence is its own kind of harm." Jin-ho didn't take the notebook. Instead, he placed a hand on Robert's arm. "Thank you for seeing," he said simply. Robert's eyes welled up. He nodded, turned, and walked out without mailing anything. That moment stayed with Jin-ho longer than any press conference or policy meeting. Because it wasn't about systems or settlements. It was about one person choosing to look and to change. Around the same time, something else unexpected happened. A group of retired police officers, many of them white, many from the same generation that once saw foreign as synonymous with suspicious, reached out through a community mediator. They wanted to meet. Not to defend, not to explain, but to listen. They gathered in a small church basement on a rainy afternoon. Folding chairs, coffee, and styrofoam cups, the smell of old books and damp coats. Jin-ho sat among them not as a victim but as a neighbor. One man, his uniform long retired but his posture still rigid, spoke first. "I served 32 years, he said. "I thought I was protecting people. But watching your story, I realized I might have hurt some too. Not with my hands, with my assumptions." Another added, "We were taught to trust our gut. But what if your gut's been trained by fear, not facts?" The conversation lasted 3 hours. No one raised their voice. No one made excuses. They just talked about pride, about shame, about the weight of wearing a badge when you're not sure you deserve it. Afterward, several of them joined the advisory board for the new cultural training program, not as instructors but as learners. If we can unlearn, one said, maybe the next generation won't have to. Meanwhile, Jinho's quiet life kept unfolding in small, beautiful ways. His granddaughter started calling him Appa regularly now, not just by accident. She'd sit on his lap while he read Korean folktales, her tiny fingers tracing the pictures. "Tell me again about the tiger," she'd say, and he would, his voice soft, his heart full. His wife's cooking classes had grown so popular the library offered her a permanent room. She now taught not just Korean food, but Japanese miso soup, Vietnamese po broth, Filipino adobo. "Food is how we say I see you," she told a local reporter. Before words, there's a shared meal. Jinho smiled when he read that. She'd always known what he was still learning. Then came the letter from Washington. Not from the embassy this time, but from a congressional staffer. A new bill was being drafted, a national standard for bias training in all federal transit and border security agencies. They wanted Jinho's input, not as a symbol, but as a citizen with lived experience. He flew to D.C. alone this time. No briefcase, no suit, just a sweater, slacks, and the red leaf from his granddaughter pressed in his wallet for luck. In a quiet office near the Capitol, he met with lawmakers who listened, really listened, as he described not just the shove but the silence that followed. The way no one stepped forward. The way being ignored can hurt as much as being struck. "What would you change?" one asked. "Teach officers that hesitation isn't weakness," Jinho said. "It's humanity. And teach them that the most dangerous assumption isn't he might hurt me, it's he doesn't belong here." His words made it into the final draft of the bill. Back home, autumn deepened. The persimmons ripened, the garden went to sleep, and Jinho found himself invited to speak at a high school, not as a victim, but as a guest in their Citizenship and Belonging series. He stood in front of 100 teenagers, most of them scrolling on phones, a few half asleep. He didn't start with his story. He asked them a question instead. How many of you have ever been told you don't belong somewhere, just because of how you look, sound, or pray? Hands rose slowly, then more. Then almost all of them, he nodded. Good, now you know you're not alone. And you know you have a choice. Stay quiet or speak up, for yourself and for others. After class, a shy boy with glasses approached him. "My dad's from Ghana," he said. "People always ask if he's legal. It makes him sad." "What do I do?" Jinho put a hand on his shoulder. "Tell his story, loudly, proudly, and remind people that belonging isn't earned. It's given by how we treat each other." The boy smiled. "Thanks, Mr. Park." "No," Jinho said gently. "Thank you." That night, as he sat on the porch with his wife, he felt a deep calm, not because everything was fixed, but because he finally understood his role wasn't to fix it all. It was to keep showing up, to keep speaking, to keep believing that one honest conversation, one changed mind, one child who feels seen, that's how the world heals. Weeks later, on a clear December morning, Jinho received a package. Inside was a framed photo, black and white, slightly grainy. It was the moment right before the shove at the airport, frozen in time. But someone had drawn a soft yellow circle around his face, and beneath it, in careful handwriting, "This is a human being." Remember that, there was no note, no return address, just the image and those words. He hung it in his office, not as a reminder of pain, but as a promise, because the truth was, the story wasn't over. It never really is. Every day, someone new walks through an airport, a store, a school, wondering if they'll be seen for who they are or feared for who someone assumes they are. But now, because of one man's quiet courage, because of one officer's regret, because of one daughter's refusal to stay silent, the ground had shifted just enough, and sometimes, just enough is everything. As the year turned, Jin-ho stood in his kitchen on New Year's Eve, stirring a pot of teokguk, traditional Korean rice cake soup eaten for luck and new beginnings. His family gathered around, his wife, his daughter, his son-in-law, his granddaughter in footy pajamas, giggling as she dropped a rice cake into her bowl. Outside, fireworks popped in the distance. Inside, the house was warm, full of laughter and the rich smell of beef broth and garlic. His granddaughter looked up at him, soup on her chin. "Appa," she said, "are you happy?" He looked around, at the faces he loved, at the life he'd built, at the quiet strength it had taken to get here. "Yes," he said, smiling. "I'm happy, and for the first time in a long time." He meant it, not in spite of what happened, but because of what it led to. A deeper understanding, a wider circle of care, a belief that even in a broken world, kindness can be rebuilt, one honest moment at a time. The story didn't end, it just kept growing, and that was the most hopeful part of all.